In 1980, Lionel Richie walked into a recording studio in Los Angeles and told Kenny Rogers he was ready to record. He was not ready. The second verse of the song didn't exist yet, and Kenny Rogers, his musicians, and his entire production team were sitting in the studio waiting for it. There is a particular kind of pressure that exists in a recording studio when everyone is ready except the person who is supposed to be ready. It is not the pressure of a deadline in the abstract sense, the kind that can be negotiated or extended or pushed back by a day. It is the pressure of a room full of people whose time costs money, whose patience is finite, and whose collective attention is fixed on a single point, the moment when the missing piece arrives and the work can begin. Musicians who have spent careers in studios describe it as one of the most concentrated forms of professional discomfort that exists, a silence that is somehow louder than noise. Lionel Richie knew this feeling well by 1980. He had spent the better part of a decade writing songs for the Commodores under conditions that ranged from comfortable to chaotic, and he had developed through that experience a relationship with creative pressure that was complicated at best. He was not someone who did his best work in advance. He was someone who did his best work when the alternative to doing his best work was something he could not allow himself to contemplate. His co-producer, James Anthony Carmichael, had observed this quality for years and had arrived at a working theory that Lionel Richie's greatest songs lived in the space between the moment he absolutely had to finish them and the moment he actually did. The song that would become Lady had been living in that space for longer than Lionel would have preferred to admit. It had started, as many of Lionel's songs started, as a fragment, a melody, a chord progression, the ghost of a first verse that he could hear clearly in his head but had not yet fully committed to paper. He had originally written it for the Commodores, but the band had reached a point in their artistic evolution where they were less interested in the kind of sweeping romantic ballads that Lionel wrote instinctively and more interested in the harder-edged material that had defined their earlier sound. The song had been set aside, which was not unusual. Lionel's notebooks were full of songs that had been set aside. The difference between a set-aside song and a forgotten song was usually a matter of whether the right person heard it at the right time. Kenny Rogers was, in September of 1980, one of the most commercially successful artists in American music. He had spent the previous 5 years building a career that had crossed the boundary between country and pop in ways that very few artists had managed before him. He had the kind of voice that communicated trustworthiness, warm, unhurried, the voice of someone who had seen enough of the world to know what mattered and was prepared to tell you about it. What he was looking for in the fall of 1980 was a song that matched that voice in a way that his previous material had not quite managed. He wanted something that was simultaneously country in its emotional directness and pop in its commercial reach. He wanted something that felt inevitable, the way the best songs feel inevitable, as though they had always existed and were simply waiting to be found. When Motown's publishing arm told Kenny Rogers that Lionel Richie had a song for him, Rogers did not hesitate. He flew to Las Vegas, where Lionel was performing with the Commodores, and listened to what Lionel had. What he heard was a first verse and a chorus, incomplete but carrying within it the quality of inevitability he had been looking for. The melody had a kind of formal grandeur that suited his voice perfectly, the emotional directness of a love song that knew what it wanted to say and said it without apology. There was just one problem, which Lionel did not mention at the time. The second verse did not yet exist in any form that could be described as complete. It existed as a feeling, a direction, a general sense of where the song needed to go after the first verse established where it had come from. In Lionel's internal geography of songwriting, this was not necessarily a crisis. Songs finished themselves, in his experience, when the conditions were right. The conditions, he was confident, would be right by the time they got into the studio.
The recording session was booked for a Tuesday morning in September 1980 at Rumbo Recording Studios in Los Angeles. The studio had been booked for the full day, the musicians had been called, the session was confirmed. Lionel arrived that morning with the particular combination of confidence and concealed anxiety that he had learned to wear in professional situations. The outward certainty of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, maintained over an interior landscape that was considerably less certain. Kenny Rogers arrived straight from a tennis match. He was still in his tennis outfit, which, if anything, added to the easy authority he carried in every room he entered, as though whatever he had been doing immediately prior was simply another manifestation of the same natural competence he brought to everything. He shook Lionel's hand with the warmth of a man who was genuinely glad to see him, and immediately began talking about his wife. Marianne Gordon was Kenny Rogers' fourth wife, and he spoke about her with the particular astonishment of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune. He was a country boy from Houston, Texas, his words delivered with a grin that suggested he was both proud of the fact and slightly bewildered by what it had led to, and he had somehow ended up married to a woman of such elegance, such taste, such unquestionable style, that he found himself thinking about it regularly and arriving at the same conclusion, that the word lady was the only word that adequately described her. "Oh, by the way," Kenny said, mid-story, the question arriving as naturally as everything else about him. "What's the name of your song?" Lionel Richie looked at him. The song had been called Baby. It had been called Baby for months, in the way that incomplete songs are sometimes called things that function as placeholders rather than titles, words that keep the space warm while the real answer presents itself. Lady was not a word he had considered. Lady was, however, the only word that made sense in the 3 seconds between Kenny's question and Lionel's answer.
"Lady," Lionel said, and then, because he was not a fool, "I'm no fool." The musicians were ready. The studio was set up. The clock on the wall was performing its function with the indifference that clocks bring to all human situations. Kenny Rogers was in the vocal booth, relaxed and prepared, doing the unconscious warm-up movements of a singer who has been in studios enough times that the preparation has become instinctive. The session producer gave Lionel the look that session producers give when they are asking, without words, whether everyone is ready to begin. Lionel gave the look back that communicates yes while meaning almost. The first verse went smoothly. Lionel had lived with the first verse long enough that it existed in a finished state in his memory, and watching Kenny Rogers inhabit it, watching the words and melody find the voice they had apparently been written for without either party knowing it, produced the particular satisfaction that songwriters describe when a song lands exactly where it was aimed. The first verse was not the problem. The first verse had never been the problem. After the playback, Kenny turned from the vocal booth with the expression of a man who is pleased with what he has just done and ready to do the next thing. "What about the second verse?" he asked. The question was entirely reasonable. They were in a recording studio. The second verse was the logical next item on the agenda. There was nothing in Kenny's tone that suggested anything other than the practical sequencing of a professional session. Lionel heard it differently. He heard it the way that a person hears a question they have been quietly dreading for a specific amount of time, as the arrival of the thing they have been managing not to think about too directly. The second verse. The second verse that existed in his head as a direction and a feeling and a general conviction that it would be there when he needed it. The second verse that he needed now in a recording studio in Los Angeles with Kenny Rogers in his tennis outfit and a room full of musicians whose hourly rate was accumulating with the steady patience of all professional expenses. "Excuse me for a minute," Lionel said. His voice was the voice of a man who has thought of something he needs to attend to briefly. "Let me, go to the bathroom." He took a piece of paper from the console table on his way out of the room. The men's room at Rumbo Recording Studios was, by all accounts, a functional space without particular aesthetic distinction.
It served the purpose that recording studio bathrooms serve, which is to say it provided a degree of separation from the main room and a surface upon which a person could collect their thoughts in the particular privacy that only locked doors provide. Lionel Richie sat down in a stall, placed the piece of paper on his knee, and began to write. What happened in the next 20 minutes was, in its way, one of the most concentrated acts of professional songwriting in the history of American popular music. Not because the conditions were ideal, they were the opposite of ideal. Not because Lionel was relaxed, he was the opposite of relaxed. But because the alternative to finishing the second verse of Lady in the men's room of Rumbo Recording Studios was telling Kenny Rogers, whose musicians were running up a studio bill in the next room, that he did not have it. And that, as Lionel would later explain with the simple clarity of a man who has learned something permanent about himself, was not going to happen in his lifetime. He had said in interviews since that you will do some amazing things when you are scared to death. This was his evidence. The second verse arrived under conditions of maximum pressure in a bathroom stall in Los Angeles, writing itself in the way that things write themselves when there is simply no other option. The words came from the same place the first verse had come from the territory of love expressed with complete seriousness, the emotional landscape that Lionel understood instinctively and inhabited without self-consciousness. When he read back what he had written, it was finished. Not finished in the way that things are finished when they require further work, finished in the way that things are finished when they are done. He walked back into the studio. Nobody asked where he had been or what had taken him 20 minutes. The piece of paper went to Kenny. Kenny read it. Something in his expression settled into the satisfied recognition of a man who has found what he was looking for. "That's it," Kenny said. They recorded the second verse that afternoon. The full song, assembled from a first verse that had been written over months and a second verse that had been written in 20 minutes on a piece of paper in a bathroom stall, sounded as though it had been composed as a single complete thought from beginning to end. This is, in fact, one of the defining qualities of great songs. They do not reveal the conditions of their creation. They present themselves as inevitable, as though they could not have been any other way, regardless of what actually happened in the process of bringing them into existence. Lady was released in September 1980. It entered the Billboard Hot 100 at number 39 and began the steady climb that the best songs make when the radio gets hold of them and refuses to let go. On November 15, 1980, it reached number 1. It stayed there for 6 weeks, tying for the longest run at the top of the chart for that year. It was the first record of the 1980s to chart simultaneously on all 4 of Billboard's singles charts, the Hot 100, the Country chart, the Adult Contemporary chart, and the Soul Singles chart. It became the defining song of Kenny Rogers and the song that established Lionel Richie as a songwriter and producer whose abilities extended far beyond the context of the Commodores.
Lionel would later say, with the straightforward candor of a man who has made peace with the mathematics of his own career, that Lady was his most profitable song, that it had bought him a house, that when his lawyer had advised him at the moment of the song's creation to give it to Kenny rather than keep it for himself, the lawyer's reasoning had proven correct in ways that exceeded all reasonable projections. Kenny Rogers would tell the story of the bathroom stall to anyone who asked, with the particular delight of a man who finds it genuinely funny and has never lost the capacity to be amused by it. He told it on the Today Show. He told it in interviews. He told it because it was true, and because truth, when it is also funny, deserves to be told. The friendship between Lionel Richie and Kenny Rogers lasted for the rest of Rogers' life. They performed Lady as a duet on Lionel's 2012 album Tuskegee, recording it together 4 decades after the original session at Rumbo, the two voices that the song had joined finding each other again across 40 years of separate history. When Rogers died in March of 2020 at the age of 81, Lionel said that everything that had happened in his life from that first collaboration forward had a Kenny Rogers stamp on it, that he could not have asked for a better mentor, that Kenny was all about love, which was, when you considered it, what the song had always been about, the specific love of a man who could not believe his good fortune, written by a man in a bathroom who could not afford to fail, recorded by a voice that made both of those things sound like the most natural things in the world. The second verse of Lady exists because Lionel Richie was too proud to say he hadn't finished it and too talented not to finish it when the moment arrived, which is, in its way, a description of how most great things come into existence, not through ideal conditions or careful planning, but through the particular alchemy of pressure and ability that produces, when the combination is right, something that sounds like it was always there, waiting to be found. Sometimes the most important rooms in the history of music are not the ones with the best equipment or the most perfect acoustics. Sometimes they are the ones with a locked door and a piece of paper and a man who absolutely cannot afford to walk out empty-handed. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who does their best work under pressure, because sometimes the bathroom stall is where history gets made. Leave a comment below. Have you ever produced something great because you had absolutely no other choice? And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments behind the music, the rooms nobody talks about, and the songs that arrived in the last possible second before everything fell apart.